Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Let's get snipping on today's 30-minute topic, date marking. As we've been presenting on the sessions this week, we've really been highlighting the Active Managerial Control Toolkit documents that we have that support the food code changes that we've made. Please look at previous sessions of our food code changes in case you need additional information about the actual code provision changes. But today we'll be focusing on the AMC Toolkit. Now, please also know that these materials are a set of recommendations to assist. They are not required to be used. If a written plan is required, an operator may submit any format that works for their establishment and their local health department. However, we are eager to introduce you to the toolkit documents. You can access the toolkit on our website, doh.wa.gov/food rules. There you're going to find 8 toolkit documents. We also have the materials translated into several languages, and we'll post those as soon as we have the translations verified. We've designed the toolkit documents as a fillable form for ease of use, but that also blocks you from making changes to the main text of the form. However, if you're savvy with Word, then you can modify the document by customizing the ribbon options and adding what's called the developer tab. This is not something that's naturally found in your Word document in the ribbon, so you will have to do a customization. Once you're in the developer tab, you can select restrict editing on the toolbar and then stop enforcing protections. There is no password needed. And again, we'll provide additional resources when the videos are posted to the web to help you if you need to make changes to the documents. So let's get started with our date marking explainer today. While our 30-minute snippet sessions are really designed to focus on the use of the AMC Toolkit documents, we've covered the specific code sections and trainings for those previously. We wanted to provide a bit of extended history on the rationale for the date marking requirement in our code during this snippet, since the concept is very new in Washington's code. Many sections in the food code are written to address the causes of foodborne illness outbreaks. So for example, Washington was the first state in the United States to raise the cooking temperature for hamburger. We did that 30 years ago in 1992, after we'd had multiple pediatric cases of severe E. coli infections. The illnesses identified that grinding meat introduced bacteria throughout the hamburger, including the center. And so the same temperature required for steak was not enough to actually destroy the E. coli that was potentially in the hamburger. So again, we made that modification after illnesses that were identified. And so we changed the requirement in our code. Around the same time, a series of national outbreaks associated with the consumption of coleslaw, pasteurized milk, and fresh soft cheese in the early 1980s led to the recognition of Listeria monocytogenes as a foodborne pathogen. So a different one than E. coli. Listeria is also unique because unlike the vast majority of other bacteria that cause foodborne illnesses, Listeria can actually grow in the refrigerator. So due to these outbreaks in the 80s, FDA actually included date marking requirements in the first food code back in 1993, but Washington did not adopt it until now. The reason why was because it was even then, it was a confusing topic, and we didn't adopt it into our state code. So it's been adopted in all of the other states, United States, except for California, and this is the first year Washington's had it in our food code. Today's discussion is also timely because the CDC announced an investigation of Listeria outbreak, and you might have seen it last week where they advised people at high risk of illness not to consume deli meats and cheeses. So this is one of the key points of watching for date marking and actually controlling Listeria, because it can cause quite a few illnesses and potential deaths. So the reason why CDC issued the alert last week was because so far they've identified 16 people that were infected with the outbreak strains of the same type of Listeria. They found them in 6 states, not in Washington yet, but 13 of those individuals were hospitalized, and then it did lead to one individual's death. So again, this is driving home the point that a lot of the times that we make modifications to our code are due to outbreaks that we've identified and ways that we can actually control them. And so that's the key component of date marking. Now, what is date marking exactly? So date marking is a back-of-house dating system. It's designed to ensure proper rotation of foods that can actually support the growth of Listeria. Listeria is pretty particular with what foods it likes to grow on. It can actually be outcompeted. So it's usually something that has a preservative in it, or it's already been cooked. You've controlled all the other germs potentially, and it's going to select for and allow for the growth of Listeria. So we're really going to focus quite a bit about the foods that actually can support the growth of the bacteria. Traditionally, they're going to be cold. They're going to be what we call ready to eat. So you're not going to have to wash or cook them again before they're served. And they're time temperature control for safety foods. So these are the foods that you're required to keep hot or cold in order to keep them safe. Time temperature control for safety foods are also, we're often going to shorten that phrase down to TCS. And these are the foods that we used to call potentially hazardous foods. The Washington Food Worker Card Manual and the FDA actually provide excellent job aids if you need to kind of review which TCS foods are included. And so we'll make sure we share those in our resource list. However, the ones that we need to focus on for date marking are going to be, again, they're going to be held cold, they're going to be ready to eat, they're going to be TCS, so time temperature control for safety foods, and they're going to be either prepared on site or unpackaged and held for more than 24 hours. So some examples are going to include open containers of milk, unpackaged deli meat, house-made pasta salad, watermelon that's sliced in-house. All of those are TCS foods. All of those were either prepared in-house or the container was opened and they're stored for more than 24 hours. So now let's look at the 2-page date marking toolkit requirement, now that we have a little bit of understanding about the requirements and the rationale for date marking. So starting on the first page, I'd like to highlight the introduction in this case to explain a few key initial points. The layout of the date marking document is the same as our other toolkit documents, but we've provided it solely to help operators as a potential training tool. Food establishments are not required by the code to have a written plan for date marking. However, we hope the form will actually help operators understand date marking a little bit more so that they can actually implement safe procedures in their establishments. So again, it's not a required form that needs to be submitted to the health department. However, we hope that it is a good training tool in helping the restaurant actually determine their procedures. Section 2 directs operators to review the refrigerated units for food that is held for more than 24 hours. This would include large storage refrigerators such as the walk-ins and the reach-ins, but it also includes frozen dessert machines and salad bars if TCS foods are held overnight for more than 24 hours. We've included several menu categories that are traditionally required to be cold held and then likely in stock for more than 24 hours. However, as we discussed, the document can be edited to focus on the food specific to that establishment. In a moment on page 2, we'll also review the types of foods that are exempt from the date marking requirement. Several types of foods are exempt from the marking requirement because, again, they do not support the growth of Listeria. Section 3 then asks the operator to determine the date marking method used. This includes whether they'll use a sticker, a color code, a marker, or other method. It also asks them to determine how they'll identify the date, such as if they'll mark the date of preparation or opening or the day the food will expire. The code does not require a certain way to mark or date foods. It's up to each individual food establishment to identify the system that works best for them. However, all food employees must know and understand and be able to explain the system so it can be followed consistently. You'll see in this section, we've added the concept of marking freezing dates. This is because date marking is paused when the food is frozen. It doesn't restart the calendar, but it will pause it. So if a food was refrigerated for 3 days and then frozen, it would have another 4 days of storage in the refrigerator after it was thawed. So I see a question into the chat that I'd like to cover before I go any further. So it's specifically about why does something like milk that is pasteurized and has a use by date on it have to be date marked? We're going to cover in a moment why some of the rationale for why these foods were added. However, the use by date is not the same as the actual potential risk for Listeria. What's going to happen is it's when the container is opened for pasteurized milk, it's when the container is open, it could potentially get re-exposed to Listeria in the retail environment. So in the refrigerator, it could be potentially inside of the unit and blowing onto the food with the fan system or something along those lines. So it's when it could potentially get recontaminated or contaminated in the retail environment because the lid is now opened. So once that's happened, we have the potential for Listeria that can actually grow inside the product. They have 7 days to use it, regardless of when the use by date is on the container. So they're not necessarily related. That 7 days starts when they open the container. It is not determined by the use by date. So we'll cover that a little bit more going forward as well. Okay, so section 4 reminds the operator that a key function of a food safety system is monitoring and verifying that procedures are working. So this section includes the requirement that refrigerators need to be kept 41 degrees or colder. This is a standard requirement, but it is key for Listeria. It is the entire reason why we reduced the temperature of refrigerated units about in 2005 to 41. It is to control Listeria. Every temperature above 41 degrees will actually increase the rate of bacterial growth. And finally, let me go back a little bit. In section 5, we actually remind the operator about the importance of training. So again, they have to have a staff training plan in order to make sure that all the staff are aware of the system. Again, the methods used to mark foods are not dictated by code, but the code does require that all staff are aware of the system, and training will be critical. So now let's move on to page 2, which is going to have additional details about some of the foods that are affected. So again, the majority of the date marking section, the plan, the training guidance is on page 1. Page 2 is very specific about identifying which foods are going to potentially be affected by the date marking requirement or which ones are going to be exempted. So let's start in the middle section of page 2. We've tried to list the foods that do not need date marking. So again, these foods are foods that do not support the growth of Listeria, or where Listeria is potentially outcompeted by other pathogens. So let's quickly go through each bullet. Non-TCS foods do not need date marking. There are lots of foods stored in the refrigerator that aren't required by code to be refrigerated. These include things like soft drinks, fruit juices, whole produce. These are often kept refrigerated, but they're not TCS foods, so they do not actually they're not required to be refrigerated for food safety. TCS foods that are kept refrigerated but less than 24 hours. So if there's a short-term storage, they open a container, they're going to serve it, they open it at breakfast and they're going to serve it by dinner, they're going to go through it within 24 hours. They do not need to date mark those foods. TCS foods that are not ready to eat. So you potentially have foods that are refrigerated, so such as raw meat, but that is not a ready to eat food item. So that would not need to have date marking. TCS foods in the sealed commercial package. Again, what we're trying to really focus on is controlling the risk of products that have been opened or prepared inside of the retail kitchen. So if it's in a commercial package, it's sealed, that is, it has to be kept refrigerated, but it doesn't have to have date marking until that package is unsealed, until it is opened. So if it stays sealed the entire time, it's always in the package state, it isn't affected by date marking. Shell stock, so oysters, clams, mussels that are still in the shell, those could potentially be ready to eat. They might be served raw, but they are not affected by date marking. Commercially prepared deli salads. So deli salads include things like macaroni salad, potato salad. They're commercially prepared, which means they're made in a food processing plant, and then they're brought to the food establishment. Even when that container is opened, it is not sensitive to date marking. Those traditionally have an acidifier or a preservative or other kind of structure that will actually keep Listeria from growing in the product. Several hard cheeses, semi-soft cheeses are exempt from date marking. Similar is cultured dairy. So things that have a little bit of an acidity to them, like yogurt, sour cream, and buttermilk, are exempt from date marking, as is shelf-stable, fermented, and salt-cured meats. And so we have some examples of those below. We've detailed examples of the deli cheeses and meats that are not required to follow date marking requirements, and these are on the bottom of the page. Again, these are exempt from date marking because they have inherent factors that they kind of restrict the growth of Listeria. It does not mean that the foods may not be linked to an outbreak if they're contaminated with Listeria. It's just that date marking at the retail store will not necessarily help reduce the risk. So, by the way, the cheeses are particularly difficult potentially to monitor because it's an ancient ingredient that has been prepared in thousands of different ways by cultures all over the world. So there are thousands of different types of cheeses. So when we worked on the rule revision process, industry asked us to continue to add to this list, which is why we're keeping this list separate. We will continue to add additional cheeses to the list when we can identify their moisture content and whether or not they would be considered a hard or a semi-soft cheese that is exempt from the date marking requirements. So we've tried to identify at the top of the pages the cheeses that they do fall and need to make sure that they are doing date marking. Again, these are going to be fresh and soft cheeses with more than 50% moisture that are required to be date marked when they're unpackaged. We've bolded the cheeses also that are most commonly found in a retail environment, just for awareness. They're not at particular risk, but these are the ones that we traditionally see in retail. So again, traditionally, when you'll evaluate cheeses, soft ripened cheeses are generally, and fresh cheeses are generally aged for less 0 to 30 days. They usually have a very high moisture content and a high fat content. They often sometimes also have a rind, so maybe a mold that's been added to the exterior. So it'll have a little bit of a hardened rind on the outside, and while the inside stays moist and creamy. That's usually what you'll see when you have a soft or a fresh cheese. They're distinct from hard cheeses and pressed cheeses, which have either been matured longer, so they have a harder texture, or they put into an additional press as well to remove the moisture. So when you're looking at foods that are sensitive to date marking, it's going to be your fresh, soft, and soft ripened cheeses. It's not going to include the semi-soft cheeses or the hard cheeses that have quite a bit reduced moisture. Okay, so I see we have a couple of examples. The use by date, forgive me for a second here. We actually have quite a few more examples here of questions. I have to go back. Is it all fruits? So make sure I answer this correctly. So is it all fruits? So we have several fruits are considered TCS when they are actually cut. So that's going to be traditionally, it's going to be the melons. So cantaloupe, watermelon, honeydew, those fruits are considered TCS foods when they're actually cut. But the vast majority of fruit juices are going to be citrus, maybe apple, and those are actually pretty acidic. And so they are not traditionally considered TCS. They aren't safer if they're kept refrigerated. We've still had outbreaks with them. You're probably familiar. We've had E. coli outbreaks linked to some of our acidic juices, such as citrus, orange juice, or apple juice. But that is because it was contaminated, and the bacteria didn't continue to grow. It was just there. In this case, it would have been E. coli more than likely. So Christine, I'm not sure if that answers your question fully. If you have more to add, please feel free. Why does something like milk that is pasteurized and has a use by date mark on it have to be date marked? We'll cover that again a little bit more in the future. Can a high cooking temperature kill Listeria? Yes. And you'll see in a moment that we actually allow what's called a reheat to actually remediate. If you have a product that you're going to heat before it's served, that can actually reduce the risk and not have to be discarded due to Listeria potential. Is the state seeing illness from Listeria from milk? So we do have illnesses linked back to dairy products in the state of Washington and nationally. They're a little bit difficult to sometimes track all the people that potentially get sick from Listeria just because they may not necessarily report. Traditionally, the one illnesses that we get notified is when it's a severe case from Listeriosis, and that's going to potentially infiltrate the central CSF. So the central spinal fluid, forgive me, where it's actually caused maybe meningitis or something where it's inflamed in your central core rather than just inside the gastrointestinal tract. So that's one of the reasons why we treat this illness so severely. We have quite a few very tight controls on Listeria in our food supply. And it's because even though the bacteria is very common, the illnesses that get reported from it are relatively rare. However, they're very severe when they are reported. What about ice cream in an ice cream machine? So yes, ice cream, if it's a TCS food, so it's generally dairy is going to be considered a TCS food. If it's not kept frozen, so below 32 degrees, it's still it's not solid to site, then it is going to be considered a refrigerated environment, and you do need to allow for date marking of that product. Okay, so I want to focus a little bit. So we try to cover what's covered on the toolkit document, but I did want to highlight, because we also recognize we'll probably get some questions about how we're doing compliance in the state of Washington. So this is a copy of our inspection report form. It's pretty standardized throughout the state. Some jurisdictions might have changed the color or the look or the layout. But again, we traditionally look at items what we call red criticals, which are the top items. These are the ones that are most likely linked to foodborne illnesses. And so these are items that we will say they're red critical. They need to be corrected before we leave during our inspections. The ones on the blue items, the ones on the bottom called the blue items, are called a good retail practice. And these are traditionally items that are going to be something that you might have an extended time to actually correct and repair. But if it continues repeatedly, it can link into and potentially cause a red critical or febrile illness. So you've got to keep both of them corrected. The first ones, the red criticals, are items that you have to correct immediately before we finish the inspection. And the blue items are items that you could potentially have a little bit longer to actually get a permanent correction. So with our date marking, we're really focusing on, again, all the items should be marked for that they're going to be used within the 7 days. And these will be determined here as a good retail practice. So it's going to be primarily education, making sure operators understand the requirement to mark those TCS foods that are held for more than 24 hours. It's going to be cited as a blue item and get correction that way, give an extended time to actually provide or make change, train staff. Again, you can potentially use a toolkit document to help industry operators train their staff and identify the foods that need date marking. However, as we've identified, we have a few foods that are higher risk for Listeria. We'll cover those in a moment, but these will actually be treated as a red critical and require immediate correction. So just the fact of having date marked foods will be covered as a blue item. It is a labeling requirement. Make sure your foods are properly labeled for back of house. However, we have a few food items that will be marked here. And this is a line item number 11. It's a red critical, and it is going to require immediate correction. And as we mentioned, one of the immediate corrections could be to reheat the food item. So let's go over the food items that we are really focused on as what we consider our red critical items that need to be corrected before we leave the inspection. When we were doing the Roy Vision, we actually worked with our industry and stakeholder partners, and there were quite a few concerns about the potential for quite a bit of additional marking and items that don't generally lead to foodborne illnesses, even if they're stored for the approaching of the 7 days or longer. And so what we opted to do during the Roy Vision process is we use the federal risk assessment, where they've determined the relative risk. The CDC, FDA, and USDA have evaluated products to determine the relative risk to public health from foodborne illness with Listeria monocytogenes. And so they ranked multiple food items that had been linked to cases of Listeria and determined which items were actually very high risk and high risk. And so this document is available for download. Again, we'll share this on our resource list as well. But I wanted to show you the items that they classified as very high risk and high risk foods. This goes back to the question that Jennifer asked about, what about pasteurized milk? It probably surprises a lot of us that pasteurized milk is considered one of the high risk foods. And it's the way they determined risk during the risk assessment was whether the food was commonly supporting of Listeria. So it's something that is commonly, or it's have a high potential for being contaminated with Listeria, because again, it supports the bacteria, but it's also a figure of how much do people actually consume. So it's not only is the food high risk for the bacteria, but is this a food that's commonly consumed in the United States? And so when they interlace those, we have items that are commonly consumed or that have a high potential for having the bacteria. And so these are the items we call very high risk or high risk for Listeria. These are the items that we've selected to actually include as our red criticals. So again, Listeria can be on a wide variety of foods. You will see products recalled for Listeria. You will see potential outbreaks, illnesses potentially linked to other products. Date marking is important, refrigeration is important, but what we're focused on during our evaluations out in the field are the very high risk and high risk food products. So these are our deli meats, hot dogs if they're not going to be reheated, pate and meat spreads, unpasteurized fluid milk, smoked seafood, high fat and other dairy products. So that's going to classically be some of the cheeses, also some of the pasteurized fluid milk, and then soft unripened cheeses. So again, when we focused on our education and our training, these are the items that we are considering a red critical that need to be corrected before we leave the establishment. Okay, so let's look at how this would look out in the field. And we fully recognize this is it's a very substantial educational kind of opportunity to, because this is not traditionally how we've looked at food in the refrigerators. We've generally looked at it to go, we need to keep these foods refrigerated. Now, on top of that, we're like, these foods need to be refrigerated and we need to make sure we use them within a certain time span. So you can see here how we have these items categorized to mark or not to mark. The list on the left do need to have date marks if they are opened and prepared. So these are items, again, if you have pasteurized milk, deli meat, soft cheeses, cottage cream, ricotta cheeses, cut melons, tomatoes, leafy greens, peeled hard-boiled eggs, sushi. All of these are TCS foods. They need to be kept refrigerated, but they also need to be date marked from the time that if they're going to be held for more than 24 hours, if they've been prepared in-house or the package has been opened in-house. Now they have several similar kind of products that don't need date marking because again, they have integral factors that actually restricts and prevents the outgrowth of Listeria. So we have buttermilk, shelf-stable pepperonis, salamis, hard and semi-soft cheeses, yogurt, sour cream, whole, intact melons, tomatoes, heads of lettuce, raw shell eggs, oysters in shell. Those do not have to have date marking. So you can see the importance of actually going through a refrigerator and making sure that the operators identify which products they have that are required to be date marked so they can make sure that they're following the intent of the rule. Now you'll see here also this yellow box. All the ones on the left need to be date marked, but the ones in the yellow box are the items that would be considered high risk that need to have immediate correction. Now, immediate correction, if the container was just opened and the operator can say, yes, I can show you, I just purchased this, I just opened this. Correction could be, let's add the date marking to it. If it's a product that's going to be cooked, then it's like, okay, let's reheat this, let's get this hot. So for us, it's reheating to 165 degrees. Would actually be remediation for these products. Otherwise, if we can't determine the date, if we can't do some other kind of remediation to control the potential for Listeria, these are the products that would have to have potential discard. So again, really want to emphasize date marking is important for all of the food products in the refrigerator that are sensitive to it. So that we have quite an exempt list. However, if they're required to have it, you need to put it on there. You need to have potentially a plan to make sure that you can train staff. And then these items in particular, the high risk food items, we will require immediate correction when we're out in the field. Okay. So now in summary, date marking again is used to control the growth of Listeria monocytogenes. A written date marking procedure is not required by the code, but will likely help train staff and encourage consistency. I do also want to call out sometimes whenever a facility is having difficulty complying with the code or meeting the requirements, we can institute something called a risk control plan. And a risk control plan could be a requirement where it's like, you're going to need to have this in writing to make sure that you can train staff. So inherently, the code does not require a written date marking procedure. However, I think if a facility is having difficulty with it, it would be beneficial to require a written procedure from that facility. And again, I really want to be clear, it's not enough to say we use it faster than the week. Active control is going to be required, and it's going to require monitoring and tracking with date marking for all of the food items that need to have the control and use within the 7 days. So again, key points for date marking, really want to make sure that we're reviewing the required and exempt foods list, identifying any unpackaged, ready-to-eat TCS foods that are refrigerated for more than 24 hours, find a way to track foods that are difficult to mark. Somebody brought up in the question about, what about soft serve ice cream? That's a classic one. It's often kept in the vat inside of the unit. Some facilities will move it back and forth. They'll drain the system at the end of the day, store the premix, the milk in the refrigerator overnight, and then restart it. Even that needs to be date marked to make sure that is used within the 7 days. Some facilities will maintain it inside the refrigerated portion of the ice cream machine. That would have to be date marked then inside of there to go, this needs to be used within 7 days. And then the system would need to break down and wash, rinse, and sanitize and replace everything, even if it's been kept refrigerated the whole time inside that unit. Also, you're going to need to make sure that staff are trained on the system, and then all of these foods need to be used, served, or frozen within those 7 days. Okay, so again, please do look for our resources on our website, doh.wa.gov/food rules. Also encourage everyone to reach out to their food safety contacts at their local health departments if they have additional questions. You can also reach out to us. It is something that again, this is a paradigm shift for Washington State. We appreciate that it's a pretty substantial lift right now to make sure that we are providing the education and helping industry to ensure their products are marked accordingly. So as you're going through the document, if you look through the date marking toolkit and you see additional items that you have questions on, know that we will continue to add to that page 2 to also identify specifically other cheeses or other products that are exempt from the marking requirement. I see we have a few more questions into the chat, but really, again, want to thank you all for joining us today. That's, I think, gonna wrap up our recorded session, and I will continue though and add on to discuss the chat here.